Welcome back to our four-part series on the Federalist era. In our previous session, we examined the challenges of establishing a new national government and the political ideologies that emerged from the Constitutional Convention. Today, in part 2 of this series, we'll turn our attention to the domestic policies of the first president, George Washington. Washington's presidency set critical precedents for how the new federal government would operate, laying the foundation for the political and economic institutions that would shape the nation for generations. We'll explore how Washington and his administration navigated the delicate balance between federal and state authority, as well as how they addressed pressing domestic issues like the national debt, taxation, and frontier unrest. As we look more closely at these policies, consider the lasting impact of Washington's domestic leadership and how it defined the role of the presidency and the strength of the new nation. Let's dive in. In addition to dealing with the formulation of the new government, George Washington was also in charge of controlling the borderlands and the backcountry, which had so far been marked by constant conflict among owners and settlers, and especially between Native Americans and Americans. Americans fought over land prices and over the rights of ownership of this land, seeking quick revenue. The government sold these huge tracts of land to speculators and large proprietors, some of whom were federal officials. The proprietors subdivided their tracts for sale, but their prices were often too high for average settlers who squatted on the lands and claimed the rights of possession and improvement. Keep in mind that most of these lands were owned by Native American tribes or were settled by Native American tribal groups. So squatters, proprietors, and the government shared the assumption that the land was theirs to fight over. The Treaty of Paris did not acknowledge Native claims and treaties. Promising these natives peace in exchange for their land proved illusory. By the time George Washington took office, the backcountries were in an uproar. Undisciplined federal troops and state militias roamed western lands in search of a fight, often attacking neutral or sympathetic villages. Betrayed and angry, natives banded together in loose confederations, retaliating against settlers and striking alliances with both the British and the Spanish. By 1789, the eastern woodlands and Great Lakes nations had been deeply altered by the westward pressure of white settlement. In the north, a group of battered Iroquois in villages traded large tracts of land for promises of security and called on tribes of the Northwest Territory to do the same. However, these peoples refused and effectively shut down settlement north of the Ohio River Valley. In the south, the Creeks, trapped between white settlements and the Native American nations of the Mississippi River Valley, allied with militant Cherokees to keep Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky frontiers ablaze with war parties. President Washington had more reason to worry about the western territories. By 1789, Spain was actively luring United States settlers into New Spain at the foot of the Mississippi River in order to weaken the loyalty of the West to the new United States government. In the Great Lakes region, Britain hung on to the string of forts that they had promised to give up in the Treaty of Paris. Many Americans believed that Britain was biding its time to regain control of lands south of the Great Lakes. This turmoil took its toll in the East. The inability of the national government to control Native Americans angered states, would-be settlers, and small business owners. Landowners complained that their property rights were not being protected, and small settlers complained of favoritism in land distribution. Understanding that both external relations and the domestic authority of the federal government were at stake, Washington turned immediately to the problem of the backcountry. Working with Secretary of War Henry Knox, Washington sought a more fair and consistent Indian policy. He also used the territories to demonstrate the power of the federal government. Less than a month after assuming office, Washington submitted to Congress a report by Knox on Indian affairs. Knox argued that the United States should acknowledge a residual Indian right in the soil not affected by a treaty between Britain and the United States. That right should be extinguished, he insisted, only by separate dealings with Indians. He recommended that the United States purchase the native claims to disputed lands, and in 1789, Congress appropriated $20,000 for these negotiations. In part, Knox and Washington shifted policy in the name of justice. But they also wanted to avoid the cost of having to take the Northwest Territory by war. A change in tactics did not mean a change in ultimate goals. Although Knox tried to keep white settlers outside treaty boundaries, his policy did not recognize Native Americans' right to refuse to negotiate in seeking to bolster the authority of the national government. He argued that these Indian bands were not communities within state borders, but rather they were foreign entities on the level of nations. Indian relations were therefore properly the business of the federal government. Knox, in effect, declared Indians aliens on their own lands, using federal policy to define these Indians as the ultimate outsiders. By 1790, continuing troubles in the Northwest Territory convinced Washington to project a military presence there. His first two efforts were dismal failures. In 1790, a combined Native American force led by the Miami war leader Little Turtle routed the United States Army, led by General Josiah Harmer. The next year, a much smaller party crushed the troops of Territorial Governor General Arthur St. Clair. In 1792, Congress authorized strong use of force with a bigger, better paid, and better trained army. Washington turned to a seasoned infantry officer, Pennsylvania Major Anthony Wayne. By the time Wayne found the Indians in 1794 at Fallen Timbers near Lake Erie, his army was more than 3,000 strong, facing a force of just 400 warriors. Wayne claimed a decisive victory that some historians would call a massacre. According to the Treaty of Greenville, signed August 3, 1795, the natives ceded 2/3 of the later state of Ohio and a piece of present-day Indiana. In return, they received annual federal payments ranging from $1,000 to $500 per band. The annuities bought the United States' influence within Indian communities and rendered the natives more economically dependent. The treaty also tried to impose white ideas of work and economy by offering native annuities in the form of farm equipment, cows, and pigs. Native efforts at Confederacy proved less successful in the South than the North, where deep fractures existed within the Cherokee and Creek nations. Older leaders, wearied by constant warfare and mixed heritage populations familiar with white economic and social ways, sometimes favored accommodation and entered into agreements they lacked the authority to make. At the Treaty of New York in 1790, Alexander McGillivray and other Creek leaders agreed to exchange lands belonging to the entire Creek nation for annual payments from the federal government and promises of U.S. protection for their remaining lands. A faction of the Cherokee Nation signed a similar pact in 1791. These internal disputes weakened Indian military efforts when the government proved unable to stop settlers flowing into the future state of Tennessee. Younger Creeks, Chickamaugas, Cherokee, and Shawnee repudiated the Treaty of Holston and attacked the Americans at Buchanan Station near Nashville, Tennessee, planning to move on Nashville itself. Fearing reprisals, older Cherokee leaders betrayed the plan and the assault was thrown back. U.S. Indian commissioners used military alliances and victories to coerce new land cessions and to insinuate white customs more deeply into Indian culture, especially that of the Cherokees. Resistance continued in the North and the South, but dreams of a pan-Indian confederation were temporarily stayed. They would be resurrected at the turn of the century by two Shawnees. One would become an important prophet, and the other, his half-brother, was named Tecumseh. The West posed domestic as well as an external threat to the federal government. By 1791, Western settlers were disenchanted with the seeming inability of the government to protect their interests, and had begun disregarding federal policy. They trespassed on native lands, sent unorganized militias to enforce their claims, and even traded illegally with natives. In 1791, Western Pennsylvanians rejected federal authority explicitly, setting the stage for a direct confrontation. The trouble began with the passage of Hamilton's excise tax. This was part of his 5-point economic plan that we'll talk about in a moment. Living in a gateway to the Northwest Territory, residents of Western Pennsylvania anticipated an economic bonanza from westward migration. but were frustrated with the failure of the government to secure passage into the Ohio River Valley. Hamilton's tax on spirits fueled their simmering anger over the questions of Republican fairness. Many Americans regarded excise taxes, which are internal taxes on specific goods, as unfair in principle. This particular tax seemed targeted specifically at Western farmers who found it easier to transport their grain in liquid than in bushel form. Popular protest intensified at each new report of the Army's failure in the Northwest Territory, efforts that this tax was supposed to fund. Western Pennsylvanians vowed that they would not pay the tax, and they urged citizens to treat tax collectors with contempt. Washington took the challenge seriously, and in August of 1790, he sent 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania. Against this show of force, the Whiskey Rebellion fizzled, but the government drove its point and power home when the remaining protesters were rounded up. 20 were sent to Philadelphia to face treason charges, and 2 were sentenced to death. Washington pardoned them both, but he had proven the authority of federal law. Western Pennsylvanians were not without sympathizers, however. The congressional elections of 1792 were contests between the policies of Alexander Hamilton on the one hand and the beliefs and the self-named Republican interests on the other, over what is meant to be a Republican nation and society. In 1789, Congress requested that the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, issue a report on the new nation's economy between 1790 and 1791. Hamilton responded with a series of reports, each corresponding to a major part of his overall plan to bolster America's economy. These included reports on public credit, a national bank, the establishment of a mint to coin money, and manufacturing. Hamilton saw a strong national government as a necessity to promote American prosperity and to protect the young nation's economic interest against foreign threats. In his view, the Constitution had created a central government with considerable power over the economy. In his reports, he urged Congress and the President to use his authority to encourage economic growth. To accomplish this, Hamilton looked to Britain as a model with a robust manufacturing and financial section, and the powerful Bank of England to energize its economy. Britain had the most diverse and sophisticated economy in Europe. Alexander Hamilton envisioned America as a powerful nation with a strong government and a vigorous commercial economy. Before he could implement his ambitious program to realize his vision, however, Hamilton would have to overcome opponents at nearly every turn. Hamilton's bold program only frightened former anti-federalists, but also alarmed strong supporters of the Constitution, notably James Madison, who did not wish to see the new government become a powerful state modeled on that of Britain. Hamilton's economic vision also clashed with Thomas Jefferson's vision of a nation of small farmers. The new opposition to Federalist efforts to create a powerful centralized government who called themselves Democratic Republicans, or simply Republicans, united former anti-Federalists and those Federalists who share the concerns of Madison and Jefferson. Democratic Republicans believed that liberty could flourish only if the states remained powerful enough to protect their citizens from the new federal government. The first part of Hamilton's five-point plan was the Tariff of 1789, and this was a tariff that discouraged foreign competition. It protected domestic manufacturing, and it forced foreign companies to raise prices in American markets and raised revenue for the U.S. government. The second part of his five-point plan comes from his report on public credit, and at this point, after the American Revolution, the United States owes a huge amount of money. It owes $20 million to the states and $40 million to private individuals that have been held in bonds, as well as $11 million to foreigners. And to prove that the United States could pay back credit, Hamilton said they should exchange the old debt, including accrued interest, for new government bonds bearing interest at about 4%, and that the government should assume responsibility for all of the war debt that the states had. They only sold these bonds to very wealthy people, so this made the average person dislike the plan. They didn't feel invested in the future of the nation, but the intent of this was to give the nation's creditors an economic stake in the stability of the new nation. The third part of the plan comes from his report on manufacturing, and he wants to show support to U.S. manufacturing at all costs, through tariffs, loans, business grants, and tax deductions if necessary. The fourth part, which we've already looked at a bit, that was terribly unpopular, is the whiskey tax, which was an excise tax on the production, sale, or consumption of whiskey produced within the United States, to raise additional revenue for the U.S. government and to establish government authority to tax citizens. And then the final and probably most controversial of his 5 points is the chartering of a Bank of the United States. The United States needed a financial institution to control the money that they raised through taxes, and the power to create this bank was not in the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton cited what's known as the Necessary and Proper or Implied Powers Clause, which says that Congress can make laws to assist in their work. And in the Constitution, it says that states have the power to tax, to mint money, or to pay debts. Of course, Jefferson and Madison have a much more strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they really reject this implied powers clause. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were a study in contrast, and it's particularly important to look at the differences between them because it will help us to understand the kinds of political parties that formed in this time period. Their backgrounds varied greatly, as Thomas Jefferson was a Southern slave owner and Hamilton was a Northerner with abolitionist sympathies. Jefferson grew up a Virginian aristocrat with every advantage that life had to offer, and then Hamilton was a self-made man who confessed that he was determined to escape his humble origins at almost any cost. Over several of the most important issues facing the new American nation, these two men found themselves in separate camps, as summarized in this table. Hamilton sought to endow the national government with additional powers, and Jefferson sought to limit the powers of the federal government and to protect state authority. The two men also approached the economy from radically different philosophies. Hamilton's idea of a thriving commercial republic was diametrically opposed to Jefferson's vision of a nation of independent yeoman farmers. Hamilton believed that America needed to emulate the powerful, diversified economy of Britain and to foster commerce and manufacturing. So this goal separated the two men over constitutional law as well. Hamilton believed in a broad or loose construction of the Constitution, that the federal government had to have wide latitude and choose whatever means was best suited to accomplish its legitimate objects. And Jefferson, by contrast, believed in a strict construction of the Constitution, so that the powers of the new government would be limited to those clearly established by the Constitution. And in foreign affairs, the two men are also opposed to one another. Hamilton was an Anglophile who believed that Britain's path to economic power ought to guide America, whereas Jefferson savored all things French, from wine to pastries, and he thought America's interests were better served by supporting France. The idea of political parties was inimical to the Republican values of the post-revolutionary era. In the struggle over ratification in 1788, James Madison had written in Federalist No. 10 that, quote, "The public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties." These partisan struggles that dominated American politics after the ratification of the Constitution forced James Madison to rethink his negative view of parties, and in 1792 he conceded that in every political society, parties are unavoidable. Although Americans increasingly used terms like party to describe the bitter conflicts of the 1790s, the partisan alignments they described had not yet achieved the organized structure of modern political parties as we know them. And so political conflict in the 1790s was really a transitional phase in the evolution of a modern two-party system. Some historians describe this period as that of the first party system, but many characterize it as a proto-party system that set the stage for the later development of modern parties. And indeed, although Americans were deeply divided politically, neither Federalists nor Democratic Republicans functioned as disciplined modern political parties. Neither group organized loyal supporters around well-defined messages at a national level, nor did either side create permanent political structures that brought local and state politics under the umbrella of a coherent national organization. The partisan conflicts of the time period produced two proto-parties, as we've discussed before, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The expansion of the press facilitated the rise of partisan politics. The number of newspapers increased from around 100 in 1788 to well over 200 by 1800. While eastern ports still sold the majority of papers, a lot of interior market towns also began boasting papers by the 1790s. Many of these papers aligned themselves with one or the other main political movement in the country. So, for example, John Finno's Gazette of the United States, which was established, he said, to endure the general government to the people, articulated the Federalist point of view. And then to combat Finno's influence, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison persuaded the poet Philippe Freneau to found the National Gazette, which rallied opposition to Hamilton and the Federalists. And this resulting battle of words between the two publications intensified this already charged political atmosphere that existed. The Federalists and the Republicans recognized that political success meant managing public opinion. All power, Madison noted, had been traced to public opinion. A free government, therefore, calls for circulation of newspapers through the entire body of the people. A new type of political organization also helped transform the political life of the new nation, and between 1793 and 1794, 35 Democratic Republican societies sprung up across America. And although not official organs of the Republican movement, most of these societies had close ties to local Democratic Republican organizations. Their goal was to influence public opinion, so the New York Democratic Republican Society asserted that public opinion is the foundation of all our liberties and constitutes the only solid groundwork for all our rights. In addition to publishing their sentiments about political issues, these societies staged celebrations, gave festive dinners, and sponsored public orations. And Democratic Republicans viewed the societies as a way to improve understanding of political issues and to refine public opinion. While the Federalists denounced these self-created societies for sowing the seeds of jealousy and distrust of the government. For the Federalists, the societies not only sapped the people's confidence in their government, but they also fomented radical ideas. The Federalists viewed the role of elected representatives much differently from Democratic Republicans. They supported a more traditional Republican ideal of virtue in which citizens deferred to the wisdom of their leaders. Once they had been placed in office, on the other hand, Democratic Republicans embraced a more democratic ideal, in which the voices of the people can be brought to bear on public questions through organizations like the Democratic Republican societies. As we conclude this second part of our exploration of the Federalist era, we have seen how the domestic policies of George Washington's administration laid the foundation for the young nation's economic and political stability. Through Alexander Hamilton's financial program, encompassing the National Bank, the assumption of state debts, and protective tariffs, Washington sought to strengthen the federal government's power and to ensure the country's fiscal health. However, these policies also ignited fierce debate over the proper scope of federal authority and the interpretation of the Constitution. This clash of visions gave rise to the first American political parties, the Federalists, who championed a strong national government and economic development, and the Democratic Republicans, who defended states' rights and agrarian interests. This partisan divide, which began under Washington's watchful eye, would profoundly shape the trajectory of the American Republic in the years to come. In our next lecture, we will turn to foreign policy challenges of the Federalist era, examining how these domestic divisions intersected with the international crises that tested the resolve of the new nation.